Deep within an ancient forest, where the earth wore a blanket of moss and the air was sweet with the scent of pine, a small fir tree grew in the shadow of its towering elders. These elder trees, with their branches stretching proudly toward the heavens, seemed to touch the clouds themselves. They stood tall and stately, their bark rugged and their roots firmly anchored in the soil, as though they were guardians of the forest's timeless secrets. Among these giants, the little fir tree felt insignificant. Though its needles were a vibrant green and its trunk sturdy for its age, it could not help but envy the majesty of its elders. How grand it must be! It often mused, to be admired by the birds, to have my branches kissed by the highest winds, and to see the world far beyond this forest. The seasons passed, painting the forest in hues of green, gold, and white. In spring, the forest floor was alive with wildflowers, their delicate petals creating a carpet of color. Birds flitted from branch to branch, their songs weaving a melody of joy. Summer brought long, warm days when sunlight streamed through the canopy, dappling the ground below. Autumn arrived with a symphony of rustling leaves, their golden tones swirling in the breeze. And then came winter, blanketing the forest in silence, as snow settled gently on every bough. For the fir tree, however, the seasons brought little joy. While the other trees seemed content to stand in quiet dignity, the fir tree longed for something more. If only I could grow as tall as the others, it sighed, its needles trembling in the wind. Then I would be worthy of admiration. Then I would have a purpose. One crisp morning, the fir tree's musings were interrupted by an unusual commotion. The distant sound of axes echoed through the forest, followed by the crunch of footsteps on snow. Birds fluttered in alarm and small animals scurried to hide. Soon, a group of woodcutters appeared, their axes gleaming in the pale winter sunlight. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the forest for the finest trees. The fir tree watched as one of the grandest pines was selected. The woodcutters circled its base, their voices low but decisive. With a series of swift, rhythmic chops, the mighty tree fell, its descent shaking the ground. The woodcutters worked quickly, stripping the branches and loading the trunk onto a waiting cart. The fir tree felt a mixture of awe and fear. So this is how it ends, it thought, to be taken from the forest. But where do they go? As the days passed, more trees were felled and carried away. The forest grew quieter, its canopy sparser. The fir tree, still young and slender, was overlooked. Yet it could not shake the feeling that its time would come. Perhaps I will be chosen next, it whispered to the winter wind. Perhaps I will finally see the world beyond this forest. Its wish came true on a clear morning, when the frost sparkled like diamonds on the ground. The woodcutters returned, their breath visible in the chilly air. One of them stopped before the little fir tree, his gloved hand resting on its trunk. "This one," he said. "It's small, but it will do." The fir tree's heart raced as the axe bit into its trunk. With each stroke, it felt a strange mix of sorrow and anticipation. When it finally fell, the world seemed to tilt, and the sky filled its view. The woodcutters lifted it onto a cart, securing it with ropes. As the cart began to move, the fir tree looked back at the forest it had always known. The towering elders stood in silent witness, their branches swaying in farewell. The journey out of the forest was both thrilling and disorienting. The fir tree had never imagined such vastness: the rolling hills, the open sky, the distant mountains capped with snow. It passed through villages where children paused their play to stare, their eyes wide with curiosity. It felt a flicker of pride. Perhaps I am destined for something great, it thought. By the time the cart reached the bustling town, the fir tree was weary but hopeful. It was carried into a grand house, its branches carefully unwrapped. The warmth of the room was a stark contrast to the chill outside. Candles flickered on the mantel, and the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. The fir tree was placed in a sturdy stand, and the family began to decorate it. Ornaments of every color adorned its branches, and strings of golden beads draped gracefully around its trunk. At the very top, they placed a shining star that caught the light and glittered like a jewel. The fir tree stood tall and proud, its dreams of grandeur realized. Children danced around it, their laughter ringing like bells. The family sang carols, their voices blending in harmony. The tree basked in their admiration, feeling for the first time that it was truly special. But as the days wore on, the festive air began to fade. The candles were extinguished, the songs grew fewer, and the children's laughter became less frequent. The fir tree's decorations were removed, and it was carried to the attic. There, in the dim light, it was left alone. As silence settled around it, the fir tree began to wonder, "Is this all there is?" It thought. Was my purpose only to shine for a brief moment, only to be forgotten? Its dreams of grandeur now seemed hollow. The attic was dark and cold, and the fir tree longed for the warmth of the forest, for the sunlit days and the star-filled nights. It began to reflect on its journey, wondering if it had misunderstood what it truly meant to be great. Days turned into weeks in the dim, silent attic, where the little fir tree lay amidst forgotten boxes and dusty trunks. Its once vibrant needles were now dull, its branches stiff and brittle. Darkness enveloped it, and loneliness crept into its heart. The tree, once full of dreams and ambitions, now felt abandoned, left to fade away like an old memory. Then, one day, the attic door creaked open, and footsteps echoed in the stillness. Light poured in as two children, giggling and chattering, rummaged through the clutter. "Let's bring it down," one of them exclaimed. "It's still such a nice tree." The fir tree's heart leaped with hope as they carried it downstairs into the warmth of the house. For the second time, it was adorned with glittering decorations. Glass baubles shimmered on its branches, strands of golden tinsel cascaded down, and tiny candles flickered like stars. The family placed gifts beneath its boughs, wrapping the room in the magic of Christmas once more. The fir tree stood tall, basking in the glow of admiration. Children laughed and danced around it, their excitement infectious. "Look how beautiful it is," they exclaimed. For the first time in weeks, the fir tree felt alive. It soaked in the warmth of the fire, the sound of carols, and the joy of the season. Yet, amidst the splendor, a nagging doubt lingered. The tree recalled its days in the forest, when birds sang from its branches and sunlight warmed its needles. Back then, it hadn't realized how happy it was. Was that simple life enough, it wondered? Why did I yearn for more? The fir tree's reflections were interrupted as the family gathered around. The youngest child, with eyes wide as stars, whispered, "Thank you, little tree, for making our Christmas so special." At that moment, the fir tree felt a flicker of purpose. It had brought joy, however fleeting, to this family. But just as before, the celebration ended. The candles were extinguished, the decorations were removed, and the gifts beneath its branches disappeared. This time, however, the fir tree wasn't taken back to the attic. Instead, it was dragged out into the frosty courtyard and left by a wall. The cold bit at its branches, and the wind howled through its brittle needles. The once proud fir tree now stood alone, stripped of its splendor. Snowflakes fell, blanketing it in an icy silence. Days turned into nights, and the stars above seemed distant and indifferent. The tree, once admired and celebrated, was now forgotten. As it stood there, shivering under the weight of snow, the fir tree began to reflect on its journey. I longed for greatness, it thought, and I found it. But it was so brief, so fleeting. Perhaps true happiness isn't in being admired, but in simply being. Its musings were interrupted by the laughter of children playing nearby. They spotted the fir tree and ran to it, their faces bright with curiosity. "Look at this old tree," one said, poking its branches. "It's so dry and brittle now." Another child reached up and plucked the golden star that had once crowned its peak. "I'll keep this," they said, running off with their prize. The fir tree stood silently, watching the children disappear into the distance. It felt a pang of sorrow, not for itself, but for the memories it had once cherished. Perhaps I wasn't meant to last, it thought. Perhaps my role was only to bring a moment of joy. Night fell, and the cold deepened. The fir tree, now weak and weathered, looked up at the sky. The stars twinkled faintly, reminding it of the candles that had once adorned its branches. "I've been part of something beautiful," it realized, even if only for a short time. The cold morning sky was a dull gray, casting a muted light over the courtyard. Snow lay thick on the ground, muffling every sound, and the air was heavy with the stillness of winter. The fir tree lay motionless against the stone wall, its branches brittle and stripped of their once vivid green. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in its solitude, each day colder and quieter than the last. One morning, the fir tree's solitude was broken by the arrival of a group of workers. Their voices cut through the silence, rough and purposeful. They carried tools and sacks, their boots crunching loudly on the icy ground. One of them paused near the tree, nudging it with his boot. "This old thing's no good now," he said. "We'll chop it up for firewood." The fir tree didn't resist as they picked it up and carried it to a chopping block. It felt neither fear nor sorrow, only a quiet resignation. Its branches, once adorned with glittering baubles and golden tinsel, were now dry and brittle. With each swing of the axe, pieces of the tree were separated from its trunk, reduced to logs and kindling. The tree's body diminished, but its spirit remained, watching silently as its physical form was broken down. The wood was carried inside the house, where the warmth and light were a stark contrast to the cold, bleak courtyard. The fireplace, an iron hearth surrounded by a mantle of carved wood, stood at the heart of the room. The family had gathered there, their faces glowing with anticipation. The father stacked the logs carefully, arranging them over a bed of kindling. The mother struck a match and the fire sprang to life, crackling and snapping as it consumed the dry wood. As the flames grew, the heat spread through the room, chasing away the chill of winter. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls and ceiling, filling the space with a warm golden light. The fir tree felt the flames licking at its wood, consuming its form, but it did not feel pain. Instead, it felt a strange peace, as though it were shedding its earthly body to become something greater. The family settled around the fire, their faces illuminated by its glow. The children toasted marshmallows on sticks, their laughter filling the room with life. "This is the best part of winter," said the youngest, her cheeks rosy from the heat. The parents exchanged smiles, their hands clasped together as they watched their children. The fir tree, now part of the fire, found a new purpose in the warmth it provided. It felt a sense of joy it had never known before. A joy rooted not in being admired but in giving comfort to others. The fire crackled and popped, its sparks rising like tiny stars. The tree's spirit rose with them, carried upward in the wisps of smoke that drifted toward the chimney. High above, the fir tree's spirit emerged into the open air, joining the winter sky. It felt the cold wind rushing past, the vastness of the world stretching out in every direction. The stars twinkled above, their light sharp and clear against the dark expanse. For the first time, the fir tree understood the beauty of the sky it had longed to touch. It danced with the wind, its essence mingling with the snowflakes that drifted gently to the earth. The tree's spirit flowed through the forest where it had once stood. It passed the towering pines and firs that had been its companions, brushing against their branches like a soft whisper. The forest was quiet in the deep of winter, but the tree felt its timeless life pulsing beneath the snow. It was part of the forest now, as it had always been, but in a way it had never understood before. As the tree's spirit continued its journey, it touched the earth, the rivers, the mountains, and the sky. It became part of the sun's golden rays and the moon's silvery glow. It joined the songs of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the gentle murmur of the breeze. The fir tree was no longer bound by its physical form. It was part of everything, and everything was part of it. Back in the house, the fire burned low, its warmth lingering in the room. The children, tired from their play, sat quietly near the hearth. The youngest reached into the ashes with a stick, stirring them until something caught her eye. "Look," she exclaimed, pulling out a small, blackened piece of wood. It was shaped like a heart, its edges smooth and rounded by the heat. "It's a heart," she said, holding it up for everyone to see. Her parents smiled, and her older sibling reached out to touch it. "It's beautiful," they said. "We should keep it." The family placed the charcoal heart on the mantle, where it would remain as a reminder of the tree that had warmed their home and brought them together. Though the fir tree's physical form was gone, its essence lingered in the hearts of those it had touched. The warmth of the fire, the light it had cast, and the memories it had created would stay with the family long after the winter had passed. The fir tree's spirit continued to soar, carried by the wind and the currents of the earth. It had found its true purpose not in standing tall or being adorned with splendor, but in giving warmth and joy to others. It had become part of the cycle of life, a thread woven into the fabric of the world. And so, the fir tree's journey came to an end, yet it also continued. It was no longer just a tree. It was the stars, the wind, the light, and the laughter. It was the forest and the fire, the snow and the sun. It was everything, all at once, forever.